I've eased into it, but hopefully soon, because this is getting a little nuts.
Absolutely. All right, I'm going to YouTube now. It's going to take a second. All right, that looks good. Let me check. All right, people are coming in. Hello, everyone. Come on in. All right. All right, I see people coming in. Come on in, and we will get started in 1 second. All right, let's go ahead and get started. I want to make the most of our time tonight. I think you need no introduction, but let's go ahead and do a brief one anyway. I'm really excited about tonight. Before my guest came on, I was just saying that this time of quarantine where we're all kind of on lockdown has been, it's different, but it's also afforded us some opportunities to connect in different ways, to in some ways reach even a broader audience. And so, you know, there's only so many places you can fly in one day, but as someone, you travel much more than me, but I travel as well to speak. And, you know, when you're at that location, you're there and you can't filter to everybody. So this can be global. This is an opportunity really for the message of truth to get out even to a broader audience. That's how I'm trying to look at it.
Yeah, indeed, indeed.
So Abdu Murray is my guest tonight. Can you just tell us a little bit about yourself, what you do?
Sure. My name is Abdu Murray, and I'm Senior Vice President with Ravi Zacharias International Ministries. And RZIM is an apologetics ministry that the tagline for our ministry is helping the thinker to believe and the believer to think. And we really do it in that order. As helping the thinker to believe, we're trying to reach those who shape culture and with evangelism. But it is an evangelism that is rooted in apologetics as the tool or as the method by which we actually express the Christian faith. But we also want to equip Christians to be better at evangelism as well. So we want to help the believers to think. It isn't that believers don't think, it's just helping them to think a little more critically on ways they can reach out to the broader culture. So as Senior Vice President of RZIM, my main role is as a speaker. I'm involved in leadership, but my main role is as a speaker and a writer. I've got 4 books out now, working on my 5th, and I enjoy that process very much as well, and host a podcast, that kind of stuff. But I try to engage people with the credibility of the gospel.
Absolutely. And in that we are both in that same line of work. And I remember training at RZIM and then even serving with you all at a university missions trip at Florida. Mm-hmm. And I love the way you operate. And I can attest that this is not just a slogan, that they really do take time. They bathe everything in prayer, which actually was kind of, it was different for me to see, because a lot of times apologetics can be very heady. But I think we always have to remember that it's ultimately not us who does the work. It's the Holy Spirit. So I really appreciate that and the work that you all do. And yeah.
Thanks, Alex. And we really appreciate you as well and working with you on that university mission and other things. Thanks for the work you're doing as well. You know, it's interesting because when you look at someone like you, folks like Ravi, who a lot of us have modeled our ministries after, we've combated the tendency for apologetics to get turned away from being the art and science of Christian persuasion. And it's turning into, sometimes based on the attitudes of the apologist, becoming the art of making someone sorry they asked. And because we want to show them how smart we are, how many facts we've learned, and we end up answering questions no one's actually asked us, versus answering the question they've actually asked. What is on their heart? Make no assumptions, just get to the heart of it.
Yeah, that's great. And many people have heard you know, Ravi echo those sentiments and say there's a questioner behind every question. And it's something I try to remember. I was a guest on someone else's channel yesterday, and that was one of the things that I was stressing, is that to me, the best way to do it or to engage in apologetics is relationally. And for someone that does what you do and kind of what I do, you know, when you fly in and you speak and you fly out, if you can't develop relationships with all those people.
Right.
But what I try to, at least for me, because I deal with a lot of youth and young adults, and I want to give people, youth pastors, parents, the skills to have consistent engagement, because that's really where you're not going to answer every question in one day. You know, that relationship allows you that time to not just bombard people with your answers.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. Well, that's part of the whole thing with equipping the church as well, is that when you equip the church to be able to answer the tough questions, you're creating a systemic a way in which you can follow up later. So when we do big missions, whether it's university stuff where we're there for a whole week, or we do an open forum like Ravi and I did at the University of Miami very recently, what you're trying to do is you're trying to get the community that works there in the area, whether it's Campus Crusade, InterVarsity, Ratio Christi, even the churches as well. You get them there so that when people come for the event, they get their questions answered, but there's going to be thousands more, sometimes hundreds, sometimes thousands, who don't get their question answered because they didn't get a chance to, but the community rallies around and they can do the follow-up as well. So the relationships are absolutely key. But I will tell you that one of the best parts of the job that I do, and I know you know this as well from your own work, is not just speaking from the platform. In fact, that's sort of like the introductory material, really. It's not even the Q&A, which I love to do from the platform. It's the conversations you have with people at the base of the platform when it's over. And then I'll tell you, we've had contact, and my colleagues in administration will get the numbers of some folks and we'll have conversations afterwards. And I've gotten some great friendships out of those with whom I've spoken and whom I led to the Lord weeks sometimes after an event.
Yeah, no, that is a excellent point, and I agree with you. I usually am at the table with my books or whatever, and those conversations go until they close the lights, you know.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, so with that, let's jump into some questions here.
Sure.
Before we even get into your new book, I want to know, everybody needs to get this book, as well as all the other books he's written. But I remember, actually, I finished reading this book the day I actually met you in person.
Was that in Atlanta?
It was in Atlanta, yeah.
Oh, wow.
And I was on the plane and I was reading it. And so, then it was cool just to meet you after that. But saving truth. Let me set this question up this way. So I do a conference every year called The Proof of the Truth. And it's titled that way specifically because I think that the foundation of every person's life, and I don't even think most people would disagree with this, is it should be truth. Even the skeptic, I don't believe that they think they're being living a lie. They think they're living in truth, right?
Yeah.
So there's a lot of types of apologetics or apologists. I'm more classical evidentialist, in the sense I say, let's lay everything on the table and let's see what rises to the top. That's the fairest way to me. You know, Buddhism is lay it all out. Let's test it by the same standards and see which one stands tall. So In doing that, you avoid kind of the ad hominem or straw man arguments because it's a fair playing ground, or at least usually it is. So when you remove the notion that there can ever be a true truth or a true objective reality, then we end up in a pointless, fruitless search. So you can't get to meaning or hope because there's no target to hit. Does that make sense?
Yeah, of course.
So can you help us examine why this post-truth, or what even is post-truth, but can you help us examine why this post-truth mindset has a faulty foundation and is many ways self-refuting?
Sure, absolutely. Now, that's Saving Truth is all about that. It's finding meaning and clarity in a post-truth world. And so you have to define your terms, obviously. And I think that you're really doing a good job of defining what it means to be post-truth. Now, I want to be careful here because we often confuse post-truth with postmodern, and they're not the same thing. So the postmodern mindset sort of is decades and decades old, but it started with the idea that all the conflict in the world, whether it's political or religious or whatever, is based on competing truth claims. You know, these people say that they have the truth, and these people say that they have the truth, and these people try to foist their truth onto these people, sometimes by force, and that creates conflict, even in inter-society conflict, where you have conflict among races, conflict among genders, conflict among different social strata, whatever it might be. So the postmoderns said, we can get rid of the conflict if we get rid of the idea of truth altogether. Because if we don't believe that truth exists, then we won't try to foist that on anybody. Your truth is your truth, my truth is my truth, and you keep yours to yourself, I'll keep mine to myself, and we'll be happy people. Well, the problem with this whole idea is that when you get rid of objective truth, obviously, the obvious rejoinder is the claim that there is no objective truth objectively true? And if it is objectively true, then the claim itself is actually false. And if the claim is actually false, you shouldn't have said it. But if it's not false, then it's actually true, which means that there is such thing as truth, which means the whole thing is basically just a morass of nonsense, really.
Yeah.
Now, what you can do is you can actually, the reason why I think postmodernism is dying its death is because you can convince someone that it's self-refuting. But what's risen up from the ashes of postmodernism isn't truth, it's post-truth. You see, postmodernism arose out of the human desire to be able to control the situation, or control the narrative as it is. And post-truth doesn't say there's no such thing as truth. Post-truth says truth exists, but it is subordinate. It's not as important as my feelings or my preferences. So in 2016, Oxford English Dictionaries named its word of the year, which it does every year, but the word of the year in 2016 was post-truth, which is anything that connotes a appeal to emotion and feeling and preference above that of facts and truth. The problem with this is the shortcomings of a post-truth mindset is it leads to bedlam, chaos, and eventually enslavement. Now, think about this. When you elevate your feelings and your preferences above the facts and the truth, what you're saying essentially is that I'm God. That's what you're essentially doing. So we talk about in the West the virtue of freedom all the time. And we use this, you know, it's the last words in Braveheart. It is the basis for the movie Glory, which is a wonderful movie. It's the basis for all these various movies where freedom is always won. The problem is that we've stopped talking about freedom a long time ago. We stopped using the word freedom in the original sense, and now we've used it with a different sense altogether. Freedom has boundaries, which is ironic, but it does have boundaries. Autonomy is what we're really seeking now, and autonomy has no boundaries because think of, the roots of the word autonomy. Autos means self from the Greek, nomos from the Greek means law. So when you're autonomous, you are a law unto yourself, which means chaos ensues, because if I'm an autonomous being, if I'm a law unto myself, and another person is a law unto themselves, and my preferences matter more than the facts and the truth, and their preferences matter more than the facts and the truth, what happens when the preferences of two separate autonomous beings collide and they don't agree? The person who wins will not be the person with truth on their side. The person who wins will be the one with the biggest microphones or the most guns. And so what ends up happening is someone's preferences get subordinated. They become, in a lot so fine a point on it, they become enslaved. So the irony is that in our quest for autonomy, the ultimate expression of freedom, we end up enslaving ourselves, at least enslaving someone. And that's what I think is wrong with the post-truth mindset. Now, no one goes around, Alex, and says, I'm post-truth. No one does that. They don't say my feelings and preferences matter more than the facts and the truth, but they prove it out in the way they act. So you can show science on something in specific, and they say, this is the science. This is the indisputed, time-honored science that's been tested and retested again to verify it, but it happens to conflict with a person's preference. They will either completely ignore that science or they will falsify, they will lie about it to get around it. That's how you know someone's post-truth.
This is great. And, I was going to go here in a second, but since you brought it up, there's a quote in your book. There's a lot of them, but I can only pick one for the sake of time. And you said, when truth is sacrificed as the burnt offering on the altar of autonomy, the resultant smoke chokes the breath out of freedom. Yep. Only chaos remains, which ultimately leads to bondage. And I love every word of that sentence, but I think, a lot of people won't get the implications of it. And because I think, okay, as you said, this whole Oprah phenomenon, you're living your truth. It sounds, happy go lucky. It makes people feel good. But if we allow people to live out of that statement, it actually puts them in further bondage than what they were trying to get free from in the first place. I was writing a blog post kind of similar or around the idea of that quote, because that quote made me think about it. And I think about, and Vince has talked about this in Jesus Among Secular Gods, that the boundaries on a football field are actually what provide you the freedom to play it and enjoy it in a meaningful way. Mm-hmm. So we have this weird idea that if we remove some boundaries, whether it be from sexual identity or what you believe about life or whatever the case is, that somehow that makes you have the opportunity or ability to have more freedom, more happiness. But then it's almost like you die by a million choices. You have so much freedom that you don't even know how to rein it in to make proper choices.
Right.
So if you want to talk about that quote a little bit more, that was just kind of my.
Oh, absolutely. Thought. Yeah, because it does. Yeah, the burnt offering really does have its own smoke, and it really does choke the air out of freedom's lungs, because what you end up having is this mistaken view of what freedom actually is. Vince has pointed it out in Jesus Among Secular Gods. The whole book I wrote basically points out this idea that freedom necessarily has to have boundaries. The reason why that's important is because it's counterintuitive to our sense of the word freedom. But Isaiah Berlin points out that there are two kinds of freedom. There's negative freedom, which is not negative in the sense that it's morally negative. What he means is it's freedom from restriction. So we don't want the government to tell us what we can say. We don't want the government preventing us from expressing our religion. It's freedom from restriction. That's negative freedom, and it can be a good thing. But there's also what's called positive freedom, and it's the flip side of the coin. Positive freedom is the ability to do something that is for the greater good. It is for the highest ideal. In other words, there's a moral boundary to our expressions of freedom. What we're doing now is engaging almost solely in negative freedom. I don't want anybody to tell me what I can and can't do, what I can and can't say, what I can and can't think, not even what I can and can't be. You can define your reality as you choose, which of course leads to this chaos where you're forced to believe things that aren't true. And it's interesting because when you're forced into that situation, like our kids, there's a phenomenon that's happening now where, and I really realize that, with COVID-19 and the coronavirus and all this stuff, anxiety among children is growing higher because of this situation. But even before the virus hit, what we ended up seeing was an increased level of anxiety among kids between, I think, ages like 8 and 18, higher than it's ever been in some reports. Why is that? They have everything they could ever want, every choice that's available to them, and they can be whatever they want. That's exactly why the anxiety is so high. Because when you tell an 8-year-old, you can pick what you are, and we're going to, by the way, enforce your decision, and we might even enforce it chemically.
Yeah.
What kid wouldn't flip out at that or have anxiety later on when they're 10, 11, 12 years old? We do this with careers too. We tell our kids, you've got to be good at this sport so you can get a college scholarship, or we're going to put you in 50 million different things so that you can actually excel at all of them. And so we put either biological pressure or we put sociological pressure on the kids. And is it any wonder then that they don't know who they are? I mean, look, I'm 47 years old. I just figured out who I was about 10 years ago. Can you imagine an 8-year-old being told, figure out who you are right now, and we're going to enforce that and seal the deal forever? No wonder they have anxiety.
Yeah.
But we think that we're giving them freedom. We're not giving them freedom. We're actually shackling them.
Yeah, no, those are great points. So last year I had the opportunity to give a TED talk, and you can't do religious stuff from that stage, but I wove in some kind of kingdom principles to talk about purpose. And the idea, part of it, and I've been in youth ministry for over 15 years. I know I don't look like it, but dealing with, so it was about choices and decisions, and there's a difference psychologically, but I kind of use that example that we tell a kid at 18, you got to make these decisions. But I changed my major 3 times in college. Most people do. I knew at 7, 8 years old, I wanted to be a doctor. I used to read medical books when I was a kid. Like, I was that nerdy.
Wow.
And then I did 1 year pre-med and changed my mind. Like, the brain is not, especially in guys, it's not even fully developed until 24?
Something like that.
Depending.
Yeah.
So why are we telling young kids that they have to make life, defining decisions at such a young age when their brain literally is not able to do that? It makes no sense. But
we're actually doing that along with the other competing thing we're doing, which is we're telling them in various forms that either A, you are little gods, or B, all you are is a chemical machine. And so with those two competing ideas being thrown at them, in the middle of it, we can say, you have to decide what you are and who you are in the middle of all that. No wonder they don't know what's going on. But what's interesting to me about that is we don't teach them the fundamental of what they are. Now, in the church, we do this, but I think in society at large, we need to recapture this idea of what you are is made in God's image. That is the central idea of every moral virtue we hold dear in the world, and especially, whether in the West or anywhere really, the very idea of equality. When we teach our kids to be fair, to share, to not look at someone who has different color skin or who has a different hairstyle or a different nationality or a different gender, when we teach them it's wrong to treat them differently based solely on those things, what we're teaching them is they have an inherent fundamental quality about them that doesn't depend on physical stature, socioeconomic standing, or any of these things. But then we tell them we're all machines.
Yeah.
Well, then machines are not created equal. They're just not. So how in the world is it that they walk away clear? They don't. They walk away confused on the whole thing. So we have to tell them the fundamental, unchangeable nature of what they are. And that leads to that purpose you were talking about, because freedom and purpose are tied together.
Absolutely. And we'll get in that. That'll be our final question. But Brandon has a question here in the chat. Brandon, you can just ask Abdu directly when you see him. I'm just kidding.
Brandon Cleaver.
Yeah. No, yeah, it is. He says, how do you speak to someone about objective truth who's apathetic toward the conservatism of the implications of subjectivism versus objectivism? So there's a lot of isms in there.
Yeah, no, I get it.
So I'll throw something real quick, and I'll let Abdu handle this. That I think, Greg Coco gives us a lot of tactics in the book Tactics on how to ask good questions, and I would start there, because in the same way that I think that post-truth, quote unquote, is as a self-refuting concept. Asking questions will help somebody see that they are objective. They do have objective beliefs and values. Almost every person does. And getting them to see that either you have to have a foundation for those objective beliefs or you don't. And if you don't, then what does that say about you, or what does that say about how you came to that belief? You know, when we talk about, when Alvin Plantinga talks about warrant, justified warrant, and is this a warranted belief? Is it justified and true? Like you don't have to go that philosophically deep with them, but getting them to answer those questions just to see where they have holes in their argumentation. So.
Well, absolutely. And if you give the real concrete examples about objective versus subjectivity, I think that it starts to hit home. I think very few people are actually apathetic about these kinds of issues. They might act like it, and they might even say, I don't want to be bothered with this kind of stuff. There's really two reasons for that. Either A, they just haven't thought about it deeply enough yet, and they don't want to be embarrassed by not thinking about it. Actually, there's probably three reasons. That's one reason, number one. Number two is they actually don't believe in objective realities, but they seem apathetic because it's like, well, those things aren't interesting to me, but these things are. And so then I would ask them the question that you pointed out, ask questions. What are those things that are interesting to you? What are you not apathetic about? Because somewhere along the line, there's going to be something that they are very much not apathetic about and have such a passion about that they're willing to defend it in a verbal death match with you. If they're willing to do that, then that means that they believe in the objectivity to that thing. So classic examples, a couple of classic examples. First, there's science and engineering. Are they apathetic about cancer? Are they apathetic about the treatment for cancer and that it's morally right for us to invest money in cancer research? Now, if someone says, yeah, I'm apathetic about that, their problem isn't objective versus subjective reality. Their problem is a moral problem. They have a little bit more of an issue than you're going to be able to deal with questions that artfully get them to the objective thing. But most people are pretty much going to say, yeah, I tend to think that I'm not apathetic about cancer research or about programs that help those who are under-resourced to be able to bring themselves out of those situations and help them. I wonder if they're apathetic about the issues of racism. Are you apathetic about that? Is it always wrong to treat people as less than you based on their gender or their race? Or are you apathetic about it? If they're not apathetic about it, then they have an opinion. Now, they might say it's subjective, but the question then becomes this for me. I've often asked this of people who believe in a subjectivism. So let me ask you a question. If by subjective you mean that the mores of the time define what's right and what's wrong, or what's true and what's false, then at one point in the United States, it was morally okay to own people as property.
And legally.
So not only was it legal, but because it was legal, it was moral because most people were okay with it. Now, did it suddenly become wrong because people changed their minds? And if they changed their minds, then what you'd have to say is that if they changed their minds and that made it morally wrong, well, then you had the South that wanted to secede from the Union, and you had the North that wanted to keep the Union together but outlaw slavery. At that point, it would have been morally justified, subjectively, for the South to secede from the Union because the majority of them thought it was fine. The majority of Northerners thought it wasn't. And so you should have had a cultural split and then made it an actual governmental politic where you could have done that. Would you really agree to that? Do you really think the Civil War was a bad idea? Or was it the most fundamentally important, morally important war of our history?
Yeah.
I think that you would say the second one.
Yeah, the great points. And you can, the majority of Germans and Nazi, like consensus can never dictate truth. That's I think the moral of the story there. And it's hard when that's the way that our society operates more often than not right now. That, well, most people want this, so that's what we're gonna do,
And apathy is just a lazy way, I think, in some ways, to get around the serious arguments on this. But like I said, there are very few people. If Twitter is any indication, apathy is not very common. I mean, People are very much not apathetic on Twitter. But you'll find something that somebody is not apathetic about, and then you can always hook it back in to the idea of objective versus subjective truth.
That's good. So actually, that leads into my next question, because I'm really want to hit this truth thing because I think everything else flows from there. So we'll get to the next book in a second. But so I was speaking in Burundi in Africa a couple of years ago. So a small country outside of Rwanda. And part of my message was about truth. And so I turned to my translator and I said, "What is 1 + 1 in your country?" He said 2. I was like, man, that's kind of crazy, because back home in Chicago, it's also 2. And the point is, truth has no boundaries. Objective truth has no boundaries. Truth is truth, regardless of if you choose to believe or not believe it. Your belief about it doesn't make it true or not. So in one of my less than congenial moments, so I think during the Q&A, somebody had said in a very angry tone, I don't believe in hell. And I was like, it's not going to stop you from going. I probably shouldn't have said that, but
well, it depends on the person you're talking to, but yeah.
But I just to kind of, it doesn't mean I'm right, but it also means that if it is a place, if it is a thing, your disbelief in it won't do anything about that.
Right.
Now we can go through some other evidence to figure out if that's true or not, but your strong disbelief doesn't make it false. Right. So I guess my question is that with the current mindset of many in society is that every individual can have their own truth, and we've kind of talked about this, but how do you outside of the subjectivism and the apathy argument that we just talked about, maybe if you were not in a Q&A session but from the stage and you had time to set the whole thing up, like how would you present the case for not that we have the truth, but that there is such a thing as truth, if that makes sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I would say there's a couple of ways to actually go about this, is that there are certain things that are what are called properly basic beliefs. And William Lane Craig talks about this, Alvin Blantinga talks about this. And a properly basic belief is a belief for which you need no more evidence than your experience of that thing to actually know that it's actually real. The example is that everyone who's watching this video or listening to us chat right now knows that they're doing that. They don't need any more proof than their experience of it to know it's true that they're doing that. Now, that doesn't mean it's irrefutable, because it could be refuted. One could argue that yes, we are brains in a vat being stimulated by electrodes from outside by some mad scientist somewhere to make us think, like the Matrix, that you and I are having this conversation. But now, here's the point. In order to substantiate that claim and overcome my properly basic belief that I'm sitting here on the internet with you talking via this technology, in order to overcome the evidence that I have in favor of my experience, which is not, experience doesn't dictate truth, but it can actually be a determiner of truth in some senses, you have to come up with a lot of evidence. I mean, compelling, strong, like Neo when he finally comes out of the Matrix and is that again kind of evidence, but we don't have that. So what I would say is the first thing is that we know truth exists because we're talking about it in the first place. The very fact that we're talking about it speaks of the truth of our existence. So existence is real, and that is a truth claim. And you'd have to bring a lot of argumentation and a lot of evidence to disprove that I exist or that you exist and that we're having a conversation. Sort of a Descartes kind of a thing. Now, the interesting thing about that is that the very idea that you could bring evidence to disprove my existence means that the evidence itself has to be true, which means that truth exists. You can't get around it. It's, to quote a RZIM, to talk about the idea that there is no truth is to talk about the idea of a one-ended stick. It just doesn't make sense. So one, I would say just the very nature of our conversation bespeaks that there is truth involved. Truth also includes meaning, in other words, coherence. And so if someone were to ask me the question about whether or not I could prove that there was a truth, my question back to them would be, when I respond to you, can my answer be complete gobbledygook and you would walk away satisfied? Or would you require there to be some kind of necessary logical coherence to everything I said? Because if we don't believe in truth, then the gobbledygook answer could be just as valid as the coherent answer. So already by asking the question, you're eliciting, you're assuming the existence of something that could be coherently understood, which assumes that truth exists as well. But the third component of this is that truth is valuable. See, every time you have a conversation with somebody about these esoteric concepts, the reality is, and you pointed it out in the very beginning and you quoted Ravi about it, is that behind every question, there is a questioner, which means that at some point, the philosophical rubber has to meet the existential road. It's got to matter to the person. You see, there's two different kinds of aspects here. There's truth and there's truth that's relevant. I'll give you an example of a truth that's not relevant. I am 6'8" and I weigh 280 pounds. That means I'm a very big man. Unless you're getting in a fight with me or you need me to reach something for you, that's irrelevant in your life. And it's irrelevant in most people's lives. I have enormous feet. I have a size 15 shoe. Now, no one listening to this is going to wake up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat with some kind of worry about the coronavirus, but say, oh, you know what? Abdu has enormous feet. I feel better. It's not going to happen. It's irrelevant. It's true, but irrelevant. Now, if we have the idea that this life has purpose, that this life actually means something, that there is a God behind it all, and you wrestle with that question, the answer to that question is true or false. That yes, there is a God, that's either true or it's false. And the answer actually matters in your and my life. That's not only true, but it's also relevant to all of our questions. So truth as a category helps us live, it helps us cope, and it gives us meaning. So truth exists and truth is relevant, I think, are the ways to go.
Sounds like you've talked about this before. No, that is excellent. I remember last semester reading some of Alvin Plantinga, You Can't Do It Late at Night. But yeah, justified warrant, properly basic belief, those things, once you understand it, then it focuses all the other questions that might hinge off of that. Another book by William Lane Craig and J.P. Moreland, Philosophical Foundations for a Christian Worldview, which is another huge book. Don't want to read late at night, but I want to read a quote from J.P. Moreland, not from that book, but from something else. And actually, it is from that book, I think. But there's also a quote before that, and we can talk about this. So this quote says, and I'll tell you who it is after: "With me, the horrid doubt always arises whether the convictions of man's mind, which has been developed from the mind of lower animals, are of any value or at all trustworthy. Would anyone trust in the convictions of a monkey's mind, if there are any convictions in such a mind?" That's from Charles Darwin, the evolutionist himself. It's kind of debunking his own theory, but that's a whole other point.
Yeah.
But J.P. Moreland, William Lane Craig, in their book, it says, "The naturalist owes us an account of what it would mean for humans to have properly functioning cognitive and sensory faculties that can avoid the idea of a designer." I do a lot of talks just because it's my favorite thing on scientific evidence. I talk about DNA, the irreducible complexity of our cells, a lot of stuff that Michael Behe talks about, because there's just, to me, I'm a very logical person, and it's hard evidence. It's not philosophical. It's not, existential. It's just this is the data. Explain this data from a purely naturalistic point of view. I don't think you can do it. So I want to ask this question in a different way. If there is no God, why should we trust our ability to arrive at truth at all? Because this is, to me, another problem that the skeptic has, that, okay, let's say we remove God from the equation, and let's say they even agree that truth does exist. But how do you know your arrival at whatever you call true is even valid if it's a purely naturalistic framework you're starting from? Do you see what I'm saying?
Absolutely. And C.S. Lewis talks about it, playing off of Darwin himself, because you just pointed out, Darwin called it the horrid thought that, how can I even trust the things that I'm coming to if I just came to them by random, visionless, no prevision whatsoever, sort of a mindless process that didn't have me in mind? I heard John Lennox put it this way. He says, supposing that your laptop was created by a whirlwind in a computer parts store, would you trust it with your homework? Would you trust it with your taxes?
Wow.
If your brain was made the same way, although it took a lot longer, why would you trust that? Plantinga has the whole idea in where the conflict really lies, where he points out that there isn't a conflict between faith and science, the conflict between naturalism and the idea of science. Because if naturalism holds, then the very ideas that we actually come to are evolutionarily driven. In other words, we don't believe things because they're true. We believe things because they're convenient for survival. So they could be false. Now, I had a conversation with a young atheist guy in Canada a couple of years ago, and he was a very bright kid. And he understood the implications of the moral argument. And he says, but here's the thing, I'm asking you to be consistent. I don't need to be consistent because as an atheist, I don't necessarily believe that there has to be a consistency in things. Things can be quantum. You know, he even used that word, quantum. Like, I don't think you understand quantum mechanics as well as you think you do. I'm not trying to be insulting. I just think that this is this buzzword for everything at the quantum level is random, which is not really true, but it's random, and therefore we can have things that seem contradictory or random in life, and we should be comfortable with these things. So I said, well, wait a minute, did you just ask me a question? And he said, yeah. I said, so if I answered you in Arabic, would you be okay with that? And what if I answered you exactly in every way opposite, committing multiple logical fallacies all the way in Arabic, so you couldn't understand the language, and even if you could, I would make no sense? Would you want me to be consistent? Should I tell you lies? Can I lie about my answer? Or would you therefore find out that I had lied about my answer and then said, that lousy Christian lied to me? What justifies your moral outrage if we can be inconsistent? You aren't asking me to be consistent. You are asking me to treat you fairly. And I think that's a moral issue. Now, if you are just a monkey with a big brain, to quote one of my favorite jurists, actually, Richard Posner, who disappointed me greatly when he said that his judicial philosophy was just, we're monkeys with big brains, period. If that's the case, if I'm just an exceptionally gifted chimp and he's an exceptionally gifted chimp, then what accounts for our conversation in the first place? Either the conversation is meaningless, in which case we shouldn't even be having it, or the conversation is meaningful, which means we're something else beyond that. It's interesting that you bring this up too, because you have at least two, and there's many, many more, but there's two atheistic thinkers that I think everyone who's listening to this should read. Thomas Nagel, professor of philosophy out of New York University, in his book Mind and Cosmos, where he points out that the naturalistic Darwinian theory of how human beings have consciousness, morality, and these things is almost certainly wrong. Yep. And then another atheist named Raymond Tallis, a very funny guy, by the way. He's a neurologist and evolutionist, and he's written lots and lots of books. And in his book, Aping Mankind, he points out a thing called neuromania and Darwinitis. Neuromania and Darwinitis are the efforts to explain everything through biology or neuroscience or Darwinism. And he says, after 348 pages of writing, how neither neuroscience nor Darwinism can explain human consciousness, morality, and creativity. He says, now you might say, Dr. Tallis, you have pointed out the flaws in a naturalistic way of understanding humanity, but you haven't given us the answer. What does explain it? And after 348 pages or so, he anticlimactically says, I don't know. And no one else does either. It's interesting because I think the Christian can offer a suggestion.
Absolutely.
We have a mind based on the uncreated, uncaused mind.
Absolutely. I couldn't say it any better. It is interesting, the lengths that some, Stephen Hawking, before he passed, much smarter than I'll ever be.
Me too.
Neil deGrasse Tyson, these, but the lengths that people will go to. I have this clip from when they were on Bill Maher, and they were trying to explain the origins of the universe. And the things they posited, it was him and Dawkins, and between them, they have, I think, 4 degrees. And just to avoid the idea of God, the things that they come up with as potential choices, it's like you're you're so smart, but this is what you're jumping to just so you don't have to say God. I remember when DNA evidence was, when Francis Crick was discovering that, and then they started talking about panspermia and like ridiculous to me ideas of some kind of alien thing seeding the earth, and that spawned everything. And but the things that people go, the lengths that people go to avoid putting God in that box is really shocking to me sometimes. And I think that's more of a, it's not an intellectual issue. I think it's a volitional issue, where most skeptics tend to laugh. Now, for some people where it is an intellectual issue, I think that's where the apologists can really help them overcome those things. But if it's just a battle of the will, only God can change that. So
Indeed,
we play a role.
But we can even as apologists, we can play the pre-apologetics role, which is something in my book Previous to Saving Truth, Grand Central Question. I actually have a whole section on is how do you actually get someone to see that their objections, while worthwhile to go into, and I'm not trying to downplay the objections, but they're not the real issue. The real issue is something deeper. That oftentimes that the objection is a smokescreen for the real issue at hand. Paul Vitz wrote a book called The Faith of the Fatherless, where he takes a look at some of the most prominent atheistic thinkers in the past century, or maybe even before that. And he points out that almost all of them had some form of a daddy issue, which affected the way in which they viewed their heavenly father or rejected their heavenly father. Now, I'm not saying that there's always a correlation there. That's not what I'm saying. What I am saying is that the scriptures say that it isn't necessarily the absence of evidence that leads to a lack of belief. It's the suppression of evidence, because the Bible does in fact say that many people actually know there's a God, but rather suppress that knowledge for whatever reasons people have. People come to a lot of beliefs for a lot of different reasons, whether it's theism or it's non-theism or it's anti-theism. People come to a belief for a lot of different reasons. And I think a good role for an apologist to take is, before you actually answer a question on an objection, try to find out if the objection actually matters to the person asking it. Can I give you an example? I was at an open forum in Calgary, and a guy comes to the microphone, Muslim guy, and he says to me, show me one place in the Bible where Jesus says, I am God, worship me, that clearly and in those words. Now, that's a common objection a lot of Muslims give. I used to give that objection as well. So I had two questions back for him. I said, first, let me ask you a fundamental question about the nature of your question. Does Jesus have to say it exactly the way you want him to? Because it seems to me that he could say it however he wants to, as long as he says it. But does he have to use your wording and your phrases? Because you know darn well that Jesus never says the words, I am God, worship me, in that formula. You know that, so what you've done is you set up a straw man. You said, there's no way you can possibly show me this. I already know that, so I'm trying to play gotcha with you. Now, what if Jesus said something else? What if Jesus said he sent prophets, that he's the one who sends the angels, that he is greater than the temple, that he is greater than Jonah, that he is greater than Solomon, that before Abraham he was, and that he had glory with the Father before the world even began? If he said all of those things, would that qualify, or do you still need him to say it your way? I wonder who's actually claiming to be God here in this. Now, what's interesting was that was the sort of the shorter version of what I actually said to him. But one of the things I said to him up front was this. So that's an excellent question. If I showed you Jesus said he was God, would you become a Christian? Because I want to know, is this really an objection you have? Is this a question you have? Or is this just the, how do I make sure that this guy looks like a fool on stage kind of a question?
Right.
Because I wasn't trying to belittle him at all, and I didn't. And I think it went pretty well, actually. But you're trying to get at the motivations behind a question sometimes. And apologists can often, and you know, Greg Kokel says this also as well, and I have a whole episode of my podcast about this, about the burden of proof. That the minute an objector says, oh, the Bible's been changed and you can't trust it, the first thing the Christian apologist wants to do is defend the Bible. Here's the 5,000 plus manuscripts of the New Testament in Greek alone. The P52 is within the 2nd century. It's a copy of a copy of a copy, and we have the eyewitness and archaeological evidence all throughout the New Testament and the Old Testament as well. And you get this litany of things. Why? You didn't make the claim; they made the claim. Ask them, can you prove what you just said?
Right.
And if you can't prove it, then why'd you say it? And if you can prove it, let's say I could provide you the counter. If I could show you the Bible was actually reliably transmitted, would it matter to you? And if it did matter to you, and then you came to believe that Jesus is Lord, what would happen in your life? Would there be positive consequences, or would there be a negative consequence? I
Yeah,
think it's incumbent upon the apologist as evangelist to ask those questions.
that's so good. Um, let's jump, switch gears to the book, the new book.
Yeah.
Um, so first, tell it. So I'm in school right now. I'm reading like 300 pages a week. So I have not had a chance to read your book.
Okay.
In full disclosure, but it's on my list. So can you tell us just the general outline of what it's about? I know originally this was supposed to be between Ravi and Nabil, and obviously we know what happened with Nabil.
Yeah.
But just tell us the kind of the backstory of the book.
Sure. Well, it was Nabil's idea, actually, and he wanted it to. It's called Seeing Jesus from the East, a fresh look at history's most influential figure. And what Nabil wanted to do was recapture the Easternness of Jesus, because
Yeah.
there's this common trope, this sort of cultural flow, where the stream of culture says that Jesus is the icon of white imperialistic, colonialistic religion, where Christianity is a tool used by colonial imperialists to impose their views on darker skinned people and women. And the reality is exactly the opposite, is that the olive-skinned religion of the Middle East, soaked in olive oil and smelling of the curries and the cumins of the cuisine of the time and of the area, is what infected and influenced positively the Roman Empire and the West, and forever changed its trajectory, because it wasn't the case that equality was an issue within the Roman Empire. That was a laughable idea. It was even inconceivable until the advent of the Christian message, which says that we're all equally sinners, but all equally offered redemption, made in God's image. So what we try to do is to recapture the Easternness of Jesus. One, to go against that cultural stream. But number two is to enrich our understanding of who Jesus actually is. Jesus speaks to some very important issues of our day now that we're only now struggling to come to terms with. Jesus dealt with racism, and he did it masterfully. He dealt with gender discrimination. He did
Right.
that masterfully. So all of these things are things that Jesus 2,000 years ago, 7,000 miles away from here, dealt with. So he crosses distance, he crosses time, and he crosses cultures. So we wanted to show how Jesus is actually both the Eastern and the Western influence, but to recapture his Easternness once again.
No, I love that, and so I'm actually one of the things not being able to travel and speak is I still want to be able to continue the teaching, and there's people who are asking questions. So I created an online course. Actually, it launches on Monday, called Bibliology. It's a cool word, right?
Yeah, that's cool.
It's not a word, but
it is now.
But what I'm I should coin it, actually.
There you go.
But what I'm going to be doing is it's going to be mostly dealing with hermeneutics, and then I'll flow into apologetics, because I think a lot of issues stem, and this is within the church actually, and definitely without. We are not taught the proper parameters. We were talking about boundaries earlier. There are proper boundaries that I didn't determine that exist for how you're supposed to even engage in the exegetical process, which is to study the Bible and to break it down. Whenever you have flawed hermeneutics, you're always going to get to a faulty conclusion.
Mm-hmm.
So I just finished one of Bart Ehrman's books, Jesus Interrupted, and even though he's a New Testament scholar, and I give him that, because of his presupposition against God, it is leading him into some flawed hermeneutical processes, and the average person doesn't recognize it because they don't study or haven't been taught. So it's New York Times bestsellers, because you can say a lot of things in a popular audience where you can't say them in the scholarly world.
Mm-hmm.
So I was reading a book, Misreading Scripture Through Western Eyes.
Yep.
It's
I
a really
quote
good
that
book.
in Seeing Jesus from the East. I quote that book.
Oh, yeah, it's a great book. And
yes.
One of the things that stuck out to me, and you can tell me from your personal experience, when he started to talk about the collectivist versus individualistic cultures.
Yep.
And in the West, we tend to have a very individualistic mindset. Even in our preaching, if you listen, it's, this is what you need to do, and God's going to deal with you this way and bless you this way. And that's kind of how the messages go. But in the East, they exist in communities. And so I don't know if I heard you say this or someone else, but we want to evangelize Muslims, but you've got to be ready to be their family if they do say yes, because they're not just saying yes to Jesus. They're saying, a lot of times they're saying no to their whole family, their community. It's bigger than just the individual decision. So, thinking that through, then I started to rethink even certain scriptures that we talk about. So there's one in Galatians 6:9 that we tend to quote to make people feel better. Be not weary in well-doing, you're going to get it. But the actual scripture says, let us be not weary in well-doing, we shall reap if we don't faint. It is totally a communal thing. Let's talk about the Lord's Prayer, or what's considered the Lord's Prayer. I really think the Lord's Prayer is John 17, but where he teaches them to pray. Mm-hmm. It says our, I think 3 or 4 times. It says us 3 or 4 times. Give us our daily, So even in how God is teaching them to pray, and you got to think about, and this is back to hermeneutics, there was an original audience. That original audience was an Eastern audience. So how would they have heard the scriptures? That is the essential meaning. Whatever we get out of it has to start from there. Yep. And we have this tendency in the West to over contextualize right away, to make it fit me. And so just if you could talk about the difference in the individualistic versus collectivist cultures, and how, if you were in first century Palestine, how would you have received the words that Paul wrote? Like, how would they hit your ears?
This is interesting because this is so key, so critical. I'm so glad you brought this up, Alex, is that we actually tend to, in the West, decontextualize it from its original context and make it into our context.
Gotcha.
But here's the key. I think the Bible is this timeless book and this cultureless book in one sense, but culture specific in another sense, because it crosses these things in a couple of interesting ways. So an objection has been raised that Jesus was actually a sexist, and that the encounter Jesus has with the Canaanite woman in Matthew chapter 14 is a good example. So Jesus encounters this Canaanite woman. She's not from the Israelites. She's a Gentile. She's actually from the people who actually oppressed Israel for the longest time. And she comes and says, Lord, help me with my daughter who's demon possessed. And what does Jesus do? He says, it's not right to give the food meant for the children to the dogs. And it's like, oh my goodness, what a bigot. What a sexist, my goodness. And then she says back to him, but Lord, it's even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from the master's table. Now, what's going on here is not bigotry, nor is it sexism. It's actually the opposite. You see, if you understand how an Easterner thinks and how an Easterner engages, if Jesus had said, your daughter's healed, that would have done nothing. Jesus was trying to not only heal the woman's daughter from the demon possession, but he wanted to dignify the woman and then teach the crowd a lesson, because the indications from the text is that the Jewish crowd wanted her to stop talking to Jesus, be done, be gone, Gentile. Even his disciples seemed to not want to hear from the non-Jews. The Samaritan woman at the well is a good example. And what Jesus does is he engages in Middle Eastern banter. It is common. It is exactly the way many conversations go, where in order to prove the point about how sexist the culture is, Jesus acts like them. He mocks them with their own statements, so they see, this is what I should say. And then when she responds back to me, because she was savvy, she was a sharp, sharp lady, and she knew what she was doing, and she responded back to him. What does he do? He elevates the faith of a Canaanite woman to superior to those that Jesus meets in Israel who have a bigoted view of the Canaanites. So he elevates, great is your faith, not so great as one and all in Israel, and all these kind of things. So he elevates it. So he dignifies her by healing her daughter, dignifies her daughter, this Canaanite woman, both of whom are second class to the Jews. And he also teaches the Jews a lesson about what it means to treat people equally. Do you see what's happening here? Is that if you don't know the Eastern context of how these things work, what you'll do is you'll call Jesus somehow an ethnically driven bigot. But you see the irony, Alex, is that when you don't see the Easternness of the way Jesus talks, you yourself are acting in a westernized, bigoted way because you're ignoring the Easternness of Jesus. And you're seeing that rather than him being a sexist bigot, he is being exactly the opposite if we just imbibed in Jesus's Easternness and understood the way he spoke. He speaks to the issues we're dealing with today, racism and gender misogyny. Those are contemporary issues. Those are Western issues. Yet he does it in an Eastern way. That's why I think the Bible is transcultural.
Absolutely. Wow. I'm so glad the way you broke that down, because it is a troubling passage. And for people, if you've never had the opportunity to go to the East or engage with people from the Eastern culture, there's no way you'd ever know that. There's no way you would just read the text and pick up on that.
Yeah.
And so I'm so glad that you all did this book, and I am gonna read it as soon as class is done.
Well, I hope you enjoy it.
So let me end on one last question. So for those that know, I outside of apologetics, I write a blog called Relentless Pursuit of Purpose. I teach and speak a lot about purpose, do some coaching. So I'm always interested. Now, purpose is this buzzword, and that's why for me, when I talk about it, I have a way to substantiate it, because I talk about the fact that if there is no value, there is no meaning. If there's no meaning, there's no hope. But value, and I'm gonna do the short version, value is never self-ascribed. In other words, your computer does not give value to itself. Something else or someone else gives it value. If you're coming from a naturalistic framework, there is no one to give you value. Therefore, you don't have it, or you just made it up. But those are the only two options. But as you said, when Jesus and Caesar, they're talking about taxes, and I've heard Robbie say this too, and he says, whose image is on the coin? And Robbie says, well, he should have asked whose image is on you. So God gives us value. And you look at the price that was paid, that literally gives value. So anyway, so value precedes meaning. And I think only in a Christian framework can we substantiate even the idea of value. If there's no value, then there's no meaning. It's just whatever you want to do. Mm-hmm. But if there is essential meaning, then there is purpose, both in a broad sense and in an individual sense. And so for me, I never tell someone their purpose, because only God can do that, but I help guide and ask questions. So I'm thinking of your background, and you didn't necessarily at the time think, well, I'm going to go to law school to use those skills as an apologist. But I think I love how God connects the dots in our life. That, and I've talked about this before, when I was in 9th grade, my teacher said, join the debate team. I didn't know what a debate team was, but a lot of those skills are necessary in my current line. I never heard the word apologetics either. So just when you have the time to think back now, how do you think God shaped you to be a unique vessel to be so effective in what you currently do?
Well, that's a great question, Alex. And, I think a lot of people ask me this question about purpose and how do they know what God's plan is for their life from a Christian perspective, or from a non-Christian perspective. They say, is there even a plan for my life? And I have an entire talk I've given called Finding Your Destiny Where Passion Meets Purpose. I think that there's two ways to look at purpose. There's an objective, general purpose all of us have, which is to be with God. Our whole purpose, our whole point of existence is relationship with the divine. But the other purpose is for us to make that truth known to other people so they can satisfy their specific purpose. Now, how you actually express that purpose in your life, how do you lead people into that relationship with God that they so desperately need, depends on your passions. It depends on how you're wired, how God has made you, and what makes you tick. So example, for me, I've always been fascinated with how people think. What are the things that make people believe the things they believe, especially about themselves, and that the things that beset them with anxieties, the thing that holds them back or that causes depression or abnormal psychologies. So I studied psychology. My undergraduate degree is in psychology. I thought maybe I'd be a clinical psychologist or a psychiatrist or something. And I very much was actually quite good at the whole idea and the whole practice of being involved in therapies of some kind. But then I also have this penchant within me that loves evidence. I love the way argumentation works. I love to be an advocate, to find out what the truth is and then advocate for that position by marshaling evidence and argumentation. So what ends up happening is I go to law school, I become a lawyer, I'm a trial lawyer, I'm a partner in a law firm, and all these things. People might say, well, wait a minute, you're doing apologetics. Doesn't that seem like a waste of hundreds of thousands of dollars from your undergraduate to your law degree? And the answer is absolutely not, because you can see, although it's a curvy path, it's a path up to the point of my passions and my purpose, meaning my destiny, because apologetics done in an evangelistic way is caring about that which makes people tick. Why did you ask that question in the first place? What is behind it in your life that makes you feel and think this way? But what are the arguments that can convince you that this answer to your deep-seated existential issue is actually true and can be defended? Psychology, law, brought together in my life. In your life, there's plenty of things, I'm sure, that are defining in that way. And for those who are watching or listening and don't necessarily know what circuitous path God has put you on. You're an accountant, you are in waste management, you are a doctor, you are an IT professional, or you're 16 years old and you don't know what the heck you're going to do with your life. I would say this: ask God about the passions he's put inside you, employ those things for his glory, and it will happen. Your purpose will be revealed. Now, if there is no God, your passions are just time savers. Sorry, not time savers, they're time wasters. You will eventually pass away. Your love of chess will matter to no one. Your love of art will matter to no one. All the medical contributions you make will matter to us on this side of the end of the world. But eventually, if science is to be believed, and it is to be believed in this sense, if there is no God, it will all grind down to a heat death, and everyone you help, and everyone those people help, and everyone those people help will all come to nothing. But if there's a God, then what you do has purpose. I remember asking an atheist doctor, my wife asked an atheist doctor friend of ours, what gets you up in the morning? What inspires you? What a great question. And he said, people, helping people inspires me. So my question to him was, why? Why would that be the case? He says, what do you mean? I said, well, you just got done telling me like an hour before that the human body is basically a complex chemical machine and we are nothing more than our bodies. So how is it that helping people inspires you? How are you a physician that helps people in the most desperate times of their lives as opposed to an expensively educated mechanic? Which one are you? And God gives purpose to his vocation.
Wow. That's a deep question right there. What did he say?
Well, he didn't like it at first, but we had a great conversation afterwards. I'll tell you that.
Okay. No, that's good. And once again, I think one common theme through this talk has been learning to ask good questions. And so obviously as a lawyer, you've been trained to ask good questions. And so it's definitely not a waste. We're glad that you're an apologist.
Thank you.
We need you. Keep doing what you're doing. God will pay off the debt.
Thank you. Well, he's done a good job of it so far. We're very, very taken care of. The Lord has been good to us in so many ways, especially in getting to do this work. You know, Alex, one of the best parts about doing apologetics, especially in an evangelistic sense, is that you get to watch God do things on different stages or in different even conversations around the world, and you get in continual amazement. Let me encourage people who are engaged in apologetics or who are thinking about it. The apologetic journey is not this dry, boring, get in the books thing. It is the ability to get in the front seat of God driving the car at IndyCar level races, weaving in and out, and then bringing everyone to a level of victory. You get to watch that, but through engaging in the apologetics endeavor. I highly encourage you. It is the adventure of a lifetime.
Amen. Well, let's end on that. Thank you so much, Abdu, for taking some time. I know you got kids around, as we all do at this time of lockdown, but yeah. I really, really appreciate you taking the time to come and just share your wisdom with us. Everybody, make sure you go get the new book and even the older book, not old, but Saving Truth as well. But I think it's so important in this day and age to make sure that we're being true to the text. And I think that's what the book that you and Ravi just put together will help people to do. It'll help them to get back to the original and start from there and grow their understanding of scripture from that starting point. So thank you again. Is there any final words?
Just one last word is that, remember, as an apologist, you don't answer questions, you answer people, because questions don't need answers, but people do. So answer people, don't answer questions. Alex, thanks again for having me on. Keep up the good work that you're doing, and all the best to you in your studies, and may you survive the lockdown.
Thank you, you too. God bless.
You too.